listening to Coffee and Conversation with Recovery Advocate Network, the nonprofit organization that strives to address the staggering disparity in resource availability for individuals suffering from mental health disorders, processing disorders, addictions, trauma healing, and sexual identity challenges. Together, we strive to end the stigma associated with these challenges so that true healing can begin. Welcome back to Coffee and Conversation with Recovery Advocate Network. I'm your host, Ange, and I am grateful for your support of our mission and welcome you to join us in building a world where individuals with mental health challenges receive comprehensive and effective treatment without worrying about financial burdens to themselves or their families or the stigma often associated with it. We will continue our podcast by broadcasting the second episode of our three-part series from RAND's official webinar on Wednesday, June 22nd, 2022. The event's goal was to raise awareness of the need for changes in the availability of financial assistance for those suffering from mental health disorders. The series is broken into three parts. Episode 1, the client's perspective, where you heard my personal story and why I became a founding member of RAND. Episode 2, which we will share today, the family's perspective, where a family member shares his journey with his brother who struggled with schizophrenia and ultimately ended his life. And finally, Episode 3, the perspective of a clinician, followed by a Q&A session. Since this podcast deals with mental health challenges, many episodes may contain triggering topics. This episode specifically mentions suicide. If you feel triggered, we encourage you to contact your support system, therapist, national and community support groups, the Global Crisis text line by texting 741-741, and/or, if in the United States, dialing 988 to reach the Suicide and Crisis Lifeline, which is a national network of local crisis centers that provide free and confidential emotional support to people in suicidal crisis or emotional distress 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Asking for help is not a sign of weakness. In fact, after I published Episode 1, which featured my story, I went and hung out with a friend to listen to it in a safe and supportive environment. I encourage you to do the same. So, fill up your coffee and let's get started.
Before we go on to our next speaker, we have another trivia question for the group. So this one is for you to think about. What is the estimated number of adults with serious suicidal thoughts? Per Angela's comment, this affects not only adults but children as well throughout our country and around the world. So give that some thought for a moment and we'll be right back after this video.
I think it's safe to say that most on the planet, humanity is suffering severe mental health issues all the time. This pandemic really brought to light how important it is for us as humans to be vocal about these issues. The sad truth is suicide levels were at their highest during this pandemic. Isolation, people feeling stigma that they can't speak about it, can't ask for help. It's such a travesty. We're supposed to be moving forward as a species. We're supposed to be enlightened and living in a time where we're progressing and we're learning to be tolerant and respectful and accepting of people more than we ever have.
Mental health means to me that I can grow and strive in the things that I want to do every day and be able to set boundaries so that I can not be burnt out every single day.
The percentage of adults reporting serious thoughts of suicide in the United States is 4.6. The estimated number of adults with serious suicidal thoughts is over 11.4 million, an increase of about 665,000 people in the last 2 years. With that in mind, I do turn things over to our second speaker, Jim. He will be giving us a family perspective on mental illness and some notes from his experience. Jim?
Thanks so much, Aaron, and the whole RAND team. What a brave journey that you just spoke, Angela, and thank you for sharing your story. So I'm Jim Schwabel. I am a survivor of suicide loss. I lost my brother to suicide roughly 7 months ago, so it's pretty recent. I'm here to tell his story and his journey and our family journey, share just sort of any lessons learned that we have faced in our family and frustrations we feel and ways that we potentially can move forward as a society and group. So my brother Tim, he was 3 years older than me. We grew up in many states. We moved 6 times growing up, but most of the time we spent in Portland, Oregon when we were really young. When I was about 5 years old, we moved to then Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. He went to high school in Pittsburgh, graduated from high school there, and had really no symptoms until he was in his late teens, early 20s. At that time, I was in Georgia, a student at Georgia Tech. And the first real warning that we got was I was halfway through my college experience, and my mom called me and said my brother had a psychotic hospitalization. And it was really traumatic. I was a student, I was thinking about going to med school. I was a Georgia Tech undergraduate. And he was not the person who knew him to be. I think he was at that point a psychotic state, talking about being a figure in Star Trek, and was in love with like virtual characters in his mind. And so I always wondered and was curious, how can we improve this? He was in the hospital as normal, admitted for 7 days. I got out of the hospital, was diagnosed with schizoaffective disorder. In Georgia, we lived in Noonan, Georgia, got a psychiatrist, met with various psychiatrists. Really hard because at that time, he was on my parents' insurance. It was hard to find good care. I think he changed drugs 4 or 5 times and was readmitted within 2 years of his first episode. So, over the years, it kept happening. We would go to the doctor, get a drug cocktail. It would work for a year or so, or 6 months. Symptoms would get worse. He didn't adhere to his medication. He'd be readmitted to a psychotic hospitalization. And this would happen every year or two. It worsened and worsened to the point where my brother was so psychotic and he couldn't even function at all. Really, he was at home with my parents. And it was, and I was kind of helping also in my free time. And it was really hard to get him proper care, even on clozapine, really one of the most effective drugs for his condition. It didn't really help his psychosis. So a lot of frustrations here, not only with the medical care he received, but the medications were ultimately ineffective. He was a treatment-resistant case. So in my free time, I started a company, Neuralex, used voice as a marker for diagnosing schizophrenia, tried to partner with various pharmaceutical companies, clinical trial organizations. I live in Boston now. I try to get him enrolled in some novel, non-invasive electrical stimulation clinical studies here in Boston. Even amid all of these efforts, the healthcare system failed him. So I can say that like over the years, all of these things have led to a lot of frustration. He had ultimately be on a guardianship with my parents, to the point where my parents had to control all of his finances just so he could direct his medical care. That actually happened in the end is about 7 months ago. I was living in Boston for about 3 years. It was COVID pandemic happened. I was probably my brother's closest friend. Being away for a while made him very isolated. He lost his job at Home Depot, which he was watering plants. Home Depot is very accommodating with his condition, and a lot of stressors came up and ultimately led to him having suicidal ideation. Every time I was on the phone with him, I tried to say, you got to have hope. You have to have some sort of hope in your condition. We're working all these new treatments in Boston. We're trying to do all these things to help you, but it wasn't enough. And I think to Angela's points earlier, he was suffering every day of his life. He was unable to really function, and he didn't really have much hope. The medical system gave him no hope. And I think if there's anything we can do is we need to find a way to give people that hope. We need to fund treatments where people feel and believe they are effective. When you go to physicians and doctors, and even clinical trials enroll in them and they fail after 15 or 16 attempts, I think the hope is really hard to have for any individual suffering. I can say that. With that being said, when my brother committed suicide, suffered and died by suicide, apologies for using that word, he had an issue where he really had no ability to have anyone to talk to. He wasn't in therapy. I think that there's something that really hit me immediately is grief, guilt, anger, frustration. I didn't really know who to talk to myself. It was really difficult. I didn't know, who to talk to, anyone that had experienced what he had experienced in my family. So I dealt with it by drawing out a lot of pictures. I had a hypergraphia moment where I thought a lot about our memories, and a way to honor him was to draw out illustrations. And I ended up illustrating about 34 images of our childhood and our life, and wrote and interwove philosophical aphorisms alongside those images. And for me, it was very meaningful because although he lived a short period of life here, he still had some things he taught us and taught me, and I didn't want him to be forgotten. It helped me a lot to cope. And I think art and its place to deal with grief is very very good way to deal with it. I felt like getting all these images out, I could share them with my family. This is one illustration that I drew at the end. This was the last one that kind of illustrates my brother on the right hand side, who's no longer here, and myself on the left hand side. And it illustrates the past and all our memories and the future that I'm having. I'm getting married this year to my fiance, Jess. He's not going to be at my wedding this year. That was something that was really hard for me. But in some odd way, he's interwoven into it. And I think there's a way to emit sort of meaning in these experiences through art. And I think this is one way I dealt with it. And I think that might resonate with some of you if you're dealing with grief. But I still feel like he's here. And I think that gives me a lot of peace.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jim. I really appreciate you sharing your story. Anyone has a chance to take a look at an incredible expression and just a wonderful story. Thank you so much, Jim.
You just listened to part 2 of 3 of Rand's introduction describing why we are so passionate about what we do. In this episode, Jim shared his journey through dealing with the grief over the loss of his brother Tim to suicide. Jim shares how creating an illustration album helped him recreate his brother's memories and tell his stories after he passed. You can find Jim's book entitled Journeys in Life, a Memory Illustration Album on Amazon. We've provided the link in the show notes. In case you're wondering, every individual working with Rand does so on a 100% volunteer basis. All funds raised go to support the mission. So, don't forget to love, not like, our podcast and subscribe to future episodes. Part 3 will focus on addiction and the clinician's perspective. You won't want to miss it. So, subscribe today. If you found this or other podcast episodes meaningful, we encourage you to share them on your favorite social network. It also helps if you give us an awesome rating so that we're more likely to pop up when someone else needs to hear these stories. We hope you will connect with us at www.recoveryadvocatenetwork.org, where you can donate to the mission, read blog posts, and stay in the loop about upcoming events, including fundraising auctions. Follow us on Facebook and Instagram at Recovery Advocate Network and on Twitter at Rand to Wellness. If you would like to share your experiences or expertise, we encourage you to be a future guest on this podcast by emailing us at podcast@recoveryadvocatenetwork.org or submit a blog post by emailing blog@recoveryadvocatenetwork.org. If you wish to provide feedback, please feel free to leave comments on the episode or email us. Now, back to your coffee.